A really important phase in ridge flying is the process of ridge testing. This is when we go and tow up to the ridge and assess the conditions. For this demonstration, I felt that a good way to show it is to use SeeYou. It's a flight analysis program, and this is a real flight log from a flight used in from a flight in our Club Grobe, and I felt it was a kind of a textbook example of ridge testing. So let's get started. Take a tow over to the ridge and kind of describe what's going on here. So in this case, we release at 2,900 feet. And the first thing we do is we first kind of situate ourselves, right? We look on over, we find the airport, find some of the key landmarks, and kind of think through the approach paths back. So we feel, okay, well, if we can stick around here until 2,400 feet, MSL, and if we get lower, well, then we're committed to this area. But before we commit ourselves, we're going to assess the conditions. And beyond that, if should we find ourselves committed in this area, or if we allow ourselves to sink down, then we've kind of scoped out the field at the base of the ridge. Now, the next step is we want to assess the conditions. And the first thing we want to do is to assess the thermals. And we do this for a couple of reasons. The first is we like having thermals because usually the ridge span does not necessarily go up to 2,400 feet, and we will need a thermal to get back. And we prefer to fly in conditions in which we can get back, and so that's at a minimum we want to know that the thermals are working. The second thing is the thermals actually are a really good way to get a sense as to the wind drift and its strength. So what we end up doing is you look at the reservoir. The reservoir is an excellent wind indicator. You look at the waves. You look at the gusts. You get a sense as to how strong the wind is in the direction. But at the same time, that doesn't tell you what's going on at, say, 2,900 feet. And comparing the two is very informative. What you often want to see is that the wind gets a little bit stronger with altitude, or about the same. If you notice that the wind is if the direction is significantly different or it's significantly weaker, it's a really bad sign. So we really like to test the thermals, and that was the first thing we wanted to do. Now, in this case, we made a little beat back and forth along the local ridge, and we sort of settled down. And we tried a thermal here, and right about here, we're not all that happy. Yeah, we preferred to have found the thermal off a tow, but instead we kind of settled down a little bit. And we kind of looked at the reservoir and said, hey, man, that reservoir, the wind's pretty westerly. It was about 300 degrees, and strength is about 12 knots. Not great. And as we're settling down, we're not feeling all a lot of love coming off from the ridge. Don't really feel all that much good air. So we're looking at this and saying, man, we really don't want to commit ourselves in this area unless, we really don't want to. It's not the conditions really aren't there yet. So we really want to find that thermal, and if we don't, we're probably going to go back. But in any case, we felt for the thermal out by the reservoir. We still had enough height to go back, and right there we found a thermal, and we were very happy to take it. And we just started doing a couple turns and climbing, but notice those circles. There's hardly any drift here. A little bit, but maybe even like about 8-9 knots. It's actually even weaker at altitude than down on the ridgetop. So just to reinforce the idea here, hey, we wanted to basically stick with that thermal for at least a little while. And so we ended up climbing and climbing and climbing, and right about now we actually found the thermal strengthened quite a bit, and we got higher and higher and higher and higher, and at noon we were actually found ourselves up at 6,000 feet. It was really nice. And so, before I get onto this particular day, this is not all that unusual in the sense that you might get over to the ridge and find that the conditions are not quite there, and you can thermal up, or maybe you thermaled up and you're not too terribly confident, and it's perfectly reasonable to go and spend some time up in the thermals. I mean, you might spend an hour or two thermaling along and waiting for the conditions to get just right before you settle on down. That's perfectly reasonable on your first, second, fifth, flights. And sometimes, when the conditions don't work out the way you expect, and we thermal up off the ridge and stay there. But on this particular day, what actually happened, which was really cool, was a nice long line, a cloud street set up along the ridge. And so we ended up soaring along it, and it was a nice way to spend some time and waiting for the wind to pick up. But just as a kind of a interesting note, basically what I thought was going on was the front hadn't fully passed yet. That's why when we released, the wind wasn't all that strong. But then when that cloud street moved in, that was the edge of the front. And when that front came in, it created a wedge, and that wedge down low, all that cold air moving in down low, it kind of pushed that warmer air up, up higher, and it was kind of that front created a nice zone of good air. So we ended up going and soaring along that front and hardly lost any altitude for a little while. We just went and flew in that wonderful, wonderful, wonderful air just back and forth. And as we did this, we were monitoring the wind and the conditions, and we were keeping an eye on the crab, and we noticed that our crab actually increased quite a bit. That front had shifted on over, and behind the front, it was actually somewhat overcast, and because it was so unstable, it had overdeveloped pretty much immediately. But in any case, there was definitely thermal activity, and we looked down at the reservoir and said, "Oh, look at that! The wind really picked up. It's now at least 20 degrees better in direction, about 320, and you can definitely see the waves and the gusts, and the wind was about 18 knots." And so this was a really nice time to test the ridge again. So we kind of mustered our courage once more and made a couple little beats back and forth. We repositioned ourselves back on the local ridge. Again, we want to be testing the ridge in a position such that we can go and get back to the airport. And so we went and made our beat back and forth, and as we're doing this, we're now finding good air. And at this point, we look down and say, man, okay, well, we're going to go and get down on the ridge. We're going to be committed to the field if it doesn't work, but it's feeling really solid. So we did just that. We came back and did a beat down on low, and we found we were going along at 80, 90 knots in a globe at 1900 feet. And that's a really nice solid ridge. And so about an hour after taking off, the conditions finally kicked on. The thermals are working solidly. The ridge band is on. And now we can go and soar that ridge. And that's what we just did. We went out there and flew the local ridge and, basically had a wonderful ridge flight afterwards. And so to sum up here, that here you can really see all of the elements of the process. When you tow to the ridge, you situate yourself. Next, you assess the conditions. First off, by looking at the thermals. Next, by testing the high band of the ridge. And finally, getting down low onto the low band and really getting a sense that the low band is working nicely. And all of those steps, in this case, it took us about, a little over an hour to get to the point where we worked through all that sort of thing. And it's not unusual for beginners to have a really kind of extensive ridge testing process. And that's perfectly fine. Most of the time there really isn't a rush. You might only be up there for a couple hours in a day that the conditions work for 10 hours. So, go out there and work through it. The more experienced guys, they will often be able to do this process considerably more rapidly, particularly when they're looking to do a pretty big flight, but they're still doing all of these steps. You never really just drive onto the ridge and pray that everything works. It's you really pay attention to all of these things and always keep an eye on your options along the way. And so this log, I think, is an excellent demonstration of how we go about ridge testing, and it worked out really nicely. And we will follow up on this by showing it in Condor, but in Condor you're not going to see a process that goes along for an hour. We're going to show the steps in a kind of a shorter sequence. But this is more of what you would expect your flights to look like when you go and you test out the ridge for the first time or your first couple flights.